What does it mean for an episode of a show to be mean-spirited? It's a term that's thrown around a lot, especially in regards to some of the most infamous SpongeBob episodes ever made. But how exactly do we define it? And what is the most mean-spirited episode of SpongeBob ever? Chapter 1. Stuck in the Wringer. Stuck in the Wringer is the episode I would like to discuss first, because I think it represents the most middle-of-the-road example of a mean-spirited episode. It's one of those episodes of a show where main character has some inconvenience and they deal with it throughout the episode. This show trope exists in a strange balance between something that just about everyone can relate to and something that doesn't make for an interesting story, which leads to this trope being both overused and underliked. This particular episode creatively uses SpongeBob being a sponge and thus using a wringer to dry himself off as the thing he gets stuck in. Hence, stuck in the wringer. This stuck in something trope isn't inherently mean-spirited, but this trope being such a bland story plot does play into why I think the writers went with such a mean-spirited conflict towards the end of the episode. Since there is just so little you can do with a character just struggling to move because some big thing is stuck around them, the writers manufactured a conflict between SpongeBob and Patrick at the carnival, where SpongeBob snaps and yells at Patrick, and then all the background fish are like, "You're a jerk, SpongeBob." The common criticism of this scene is that it paints SpongeBob as being in the wrong when it was actually Patrick's fault that SpongeBob got stuck in the wringer in the first place by using the forever glue on him. This criticism is valid, but it only looks at the surface of why this episode comes off as so mean-spirited. And in order to figure out what I mean by that, we have to discuss the concept of being mean-spirited. So when I say something is mean-spirited, I'm not just complaining about the story being negative, as all stories portray something negative. It's called conflict. When I call a story mean-spirited, I'm saying that the story provides little emotional reaction other than feelings of disgust, anger, or sadness. Now, in a vacuum, there is nothing wrong with a narrative making their audience feel this way, as these emotions are necessary to shaping our perspectives towards negative behaviors and outcomes. If a movie about war makes you feel sad and scared, that's not the movie inherently being mean-spirited, it's just the movie invoking an emotional response from you in order to tell its story. But when you look at something like Stuck in the Wringer, while it does use these negative emotions to communicate its story, since the story itself is so shallow, all you are really left with is the negative emotions. At the end of the episode, SpongeBob escapes from the wringer because it turns out that tears can melt the forever glue. SpongeBob then says this to the camera:
"I guess crying does solve your problems after all."
So this line actually could kind of work as some sort of anti-lesson, and even a way of saying that it's okay to cry. But the episode itself has so little substance that this moment almost feels like it's mocking me. Like it's telling me, this episode was a waste of time, huh? To compare this, "I guess crying can solve your problems" moment to SpongeBob's dramatic speech at the end of Band Geeks, you can see a good and bad example of an anti-lesson. In Band Geeks, SpongeBob encourages his fellow Band Geeks to step up and support Squidward by asking them to pretend that Squidward is a fireman or some guy in an ambulance. What makes this an anti-lesson is that it subverts the usual kind of speech this would be, which would be some big statement about how we should all be good to our fellow man because anyone deserves it, and instead says, Squidward doesn't deserve it, but let's just pretend he does. But the reason that this moment from Band Geeks works while this moment from Stuck in the Wringer doesn't, despite the fact that they are both similar sorts of anti-lessons, is because Band Geeks actually does tell a deep story about working together for the sake of your fellow man, while Stuck in the Wringer is just 11 minutes of having bad things happen to SpongeBob for the sake of progressing conflict and wasting the viewer's time. And even though I consider Band Geeks sort of an anti-lesson, while it's an anti-lesson in the sense that it's not as in your face about what the lesson should be, it still communicates the same lesson as some big speech about how we should be good to our fellow man. And I would argue that it actually communicates that lesson better because it doesn't come off as preachy. Whereas the Stuck in the Wringer crying line just kind of means nothing. And that's all Stuck in the Wringer amounts to. Nothing. A waste of the viewer's time. The writers needed another episode, so they manufactured a conflict that's been done a million times, and kept escalating that conflict with no regard for making any sort of meaningful statement, and that is what makes this episode so mean-spirited. Chapter 2. Are You Happy Now? Are You Happy Now is an episode that is most remembered for 2 poor taste jokes. But beyond that, is it that much of a mean-spirited episode? The episode revolves around Squidward realizing he has never had a happy memory and falling into depression. This premise is something many people take issue with because they think it contradicts previous episodes, since Squidward is shown to be happy many other times in the series. However, I think in this instance, the actual story of this episode is more important than that small continuity nitpick. There are depressive people out there who actually do believe this about themselves, and by having that attitude be reflected through Squidward, someone who has such depressive tendencies can feel heard and represented through the character. In a long-running show, there would be no reasonable way to do a plot like this without such an inconsistency, because in any long-running show, you're almost inevitably going to have an episode where a character gets some kind of big win, such as Squidward in Band Geeks. But should that really mean that they have to throw out a concept like a character feel like they've never had a happy ending? Which again, is a strong premise for an episode revolving around depression. And like, Band Geeks isn't exactly foundational lore to the series. While sometimes Band Geeks is referenced to have happened, it, as an episode, was never meant to shake up the status quo. And lastly, even if you don't ignore the existence of Band Geeks, it still can make sense that Squidward would believe that he has never had a happy memory, because that's just how depressed people view their own lives sometimes. Now, perhaps that message would have been better if the episode had addressed previous times in the series where Squidward was happy, like having SpongeBob say something like, "What about when we played at the Bubble Bowl?" and Squidward making some kind of excuse as to why it isn't actually a happy memory. While this would have solved the continuity issue, I think it was better that the writers just didn't address Band Geeks at all. Because 1, it would have retroactively sullied the triumphant ending of Band Geeks, and 2, it would have been pretty clunky pacing-wise when the episode already did a good enough job setting up its premise. So, because Squidward never had a happy memory, SpongeBob tries to make one for him, and because of that, hijinks ensue. This is where the episode gets into Squidward torture territory. Now, if you've seen my Squidward torture video, link in the description, you would know that what makes or breaks an episode like this is whether or not the negative thing that happens to Squidward in the episode is used to either make a statement about his behavior or motivate the story. And in the case of Are You Happy Now? It absolutely motivates the story. While a lot of things go wrong when SpongeBob takes Squidward to the various happy memory activities, like him getting a violin bow in his eye at the concert hall, seeing his art get destroyed at the museum, and his fear of heights get triggered in the hot air balloon, all of these occurrences motivate the story. The statement that the narrative is trying to make is that things go wrong sometimes, even in otherwise happy places. And by having these bad things happen to Squidward, even if they are undeserved, it helps sell that narrative, as these bad things happening challenges Squidward to overcome them. There is one moment that I will nitpick, and it's when Sponge and Squid end up on top of the mountain after the hot air balloon fiasco, and SpongeBob places a flag on Squidward's foot, which, one, is a gross out moment with a close-up on the hurt foot, which isn't that disgusting compared to other gross out but still unpleasant. And 2, it's a little more of a phoned in way of ruining the moment. Like, all the other moment ruining incidents are more tied to the situation the characters were in. And this one just kind of feels like, how can we hurt Squidward again because he's the character we hurt? It didn't help sell the story as much here, and is a symptom of the writers not being that in tune with their story and focusing a bit more on torturing the character and a bit less on the story. Despite the fact that for a good majority of this episode, they do a decent job. After these failures, there's a couple of scenes that detail Squidward's depression, and this is the part of the episode where the controversial jokes come in. Now, I don't think that this is some kind of subject that should never be joked about, or that these jokes would introduce to kids what these sort of actions are, as you would have to previously know what these actions actually are in order to understand the joke. The problem with these jokes, really, is that they just aren't that funny. I'm not laughing because I'm offended. The structure of the jokes just doesn't really hit very hard. Every good joke has an underlying message, and the underlying message to these jokes is Squidward might do really bad thing, but it turns out to be good thing. But that joke actually doesn't make any sense within the broader story. The whole point of this whole depressive sequence is that Squidward has given up and stopped trying to make himself happy. But if he's getting himself a new pet and cooking himself brownies, that shows an attempt at making himself happy, which contradicts the actual message of the sequence. The reason I think that these jokes are so out of place within the sequence is that the writers just kind of wanted to be edgy, and that's what makes these jokes so mean-spirited. Instead of focusing on the serious topic of the story, the team behind the episode instead resorted to shock value, and that inconsistency just leaves us all feeling icky. The ending of the episode does kind of tie things together pretty well. SpongeBob invites Squidward to a party at the Krusty Krab, but since no one else shows up, he makes a bunch of papier-mâché SpongeBobs that Squidward starts destroying, and that becomes Squidward's happiest memory. One could maybe argue that this ending is mean-spirited, but I actually find it to be pretty positive. Sometimes you do kind of need to let your emotions out a little bit, and SpongeBob himself doesn't seem to mind Squidward destroying all the fake sponges because he's just glad to see his friend happy. For such a mean-spirited episode, I do have to give Are You Happy Now a little bit of credit for at least trying to have a positive message. Chapter 3. A Pal for Gary. A Pal for Gary is the most mean-spirited Gary-focused episode, and that makes its mean-spiritedness even worse. Stories will always have something bad happen to a character in order to progress the plot, but when the bad thing that is happening to an animal, it is a lot harder to enjoy what we are watching. See, usually when something bad happens to a character, it is either used to make a statement about their past behavior, or it's to meaningfully challenge them. Both of these reasons work best with sapient beings like humans, or in the case of SpongeBob, characters that are based on animals but behave like humans. Animals operate on instinct and are not subject to making moral choices. As such, all non-human animals are inherently innocent creatures. This does not mean that something bad can never happen to an innocent animal in a story. It just means that when it does happen, it has to make some kind of statement about the choices of whichever human or human-coded character is adjacent to said animal. Earlier, I talked about Squidward torture and how it is an infamous kind of SpongeBob episode when Squidward doesn't narratively deserve the things that are torturing him. As bad as Squidward torture can be, at least in some instances, Squidward can deserve what he has coming to him, and the episodes can work. The same cannot be said for Gary torture, which is what this episode falls into the category of. Since Gary is an animal, and by definition innocent and pure, anything that happens to Gary is by definition not narratively deserved. The story could have still worked even with everything Gary goes through if the message of the story was framed through SpongeBob learning something through the suffering of his pet. But SpongeBob is so oblivious in this episode that nothing really happens other than this poor snail getting worked over. The episode has a hard time deciding if Gary is just an animal or a being with a little more autonomy. The fact that in the very end of the episode it is Gary who saves SpongeBob by lassoing the monster is an action that would usually be befitting of the character who actually goes through a character arc. But the character that goes through a character arc is usually the character who has a meaningful character flaw that they need to overcome. Gary has no character flaw throughout the episode. SpongeBob does. So everything is just backwards. Gary can work as a character with autonomy. Sometimes the show does play around with the idea that Gary is a bit more sapient than he lets on. An episode that does this well is Gary Takes a Bath, because that episode communicates that Gary is actively choosing to defy SpongeBob's wishes the way a child would to their parents. However, in Gary Takes a Bath, while both Gary and SpongeBob have character flaws that the narrative criticizes, it is still more critical of SpongeBob, which is why SpongeBob is the one who ends up punished in the end. A pal for Gary doesn't meaningfully punish SpongeBob at all. Sure, his house gets all messed up by the monster, but SpongeBob doesn't react to it much, so it's clearly not framed as his narrative punishment. He doesn't even meaningfully realize how poorly he treated Gary throughout the episode. At the very end, when SpongeBob decides to take Gary to work, it almost seems as though Gary gets punished with the whole free labor comment from Krabs. The whole episode seems like it's trying to make a statement about irresponsible pet ownership, but by over-punishing the pet and under-punishing the irresponsible owner, its message got jumbled into one big mean-spirited mess. Chapter 4, The Card. The Card is an episode that I have a bit more of a personal gripe with due to the fact that I'm an avid Pokemon card collector, so an episode revolving around an ultra-rare card getting destroyed by an irresponsible owner who doesn't understand its value is one I found to be particularly offensive. While revisiting this episode, I had at first thought that I was maybe too hard on it when I was a kid due to this bias. The first half or so of the episode does a good job at establishing SpongeBob as a perfectionist with the whole bank scene where he won't accept wrinkly currency, showing the attitude difference between him and Patrick in their scene in the store, and making you feel SpongeBob's frustration at opening all the card packs in a well-animated, humorous anti-consumerism sequence. The part of this episode that becomes too mean-spirited is the inconsistent nature of Patrick's obliviousness. If this episode had throughout its runtime had Patrick be completely oblivious to why the card meant so much to SpongeBob, then even though it would be an unpleasant watch for collectible card connoisseurs like me, it would have been a solid narrative about SpongeBob having to accept not only that someone close to him has the possession that he covets, but that not everyone around you is always going to value certain things as much as you might. But there are two moments in the episode that completely undermine that story. The first one is this.
SpongeBob, you can't always expect my usual brand of stupidity. I like to mix it up.
The problem with this moment is that it shows that Patrick is aware that he is stupid and that he actively leans into it for no other reason than to mess with people. I actually don't hate this line as much as most people do. I can kind of see it for what it is, a sort of meta commentary on Patrick's dumbness. And if you don't take the line too seriously, it doesn't really ruin the episode too much. I actually think the worst part of Patrick's character in this episode is that he later on offers to just give the card to SpongeBob, and they have a pretty nice friendship moment, only for him to take it back and ruin the card later on. If this episode ended right here at the friendship moment, sure, it wouldn't have been amazing, but it would have been a nice little arc for both of the characters. However, Patrick, for no reason, asks if he can keep the card for the rest of the night and give it to him tomorrow, which, why? The character motivation makes no sense. Patrick clearly doesn't care about the card. He even had a moment of friendship-motivated clarity where he realized SpongeBob wanted it more. It just doesn't make any sense narratively why Patrick would want to keep the card, other than that the plot wanted him to have it for a little longer so he could destroy it and manufacture more conflict. And that's really what makes this episode mean-spirited. In the earlier scenes where Patrick was using the card on his teeth, almost got hit by mud, or almost went underwater, those scenes were unpleasant, sure. But that unpleasantness drove the story. It drove the characters. But now, after Patrick has already been shown to realize how much the card means to SpongeBob, the unpleasantness has lost all story and character motivation, and it is just reduced to mean-spirited noise. The ending twist of the episode is that after Patrick destroys the titular card, it turns out that the pack Patrick bought actually contained 4 other copies of the card. The joke being that the only 5 copies of the card in existence all ended up in the same pack. It's a clever twist, but it doesn't meaningfully address the character flaws that the episode is trying to criticize, which is SpongeBob's desire for perfection and Patrick's lack of social awareness. The episode could have had such an easy fix. You should still have Patrick realize that SpongeBob wants the card and decide to give it to him, but by the time Patrick gives him the card, it's already pretty beat up. Not completely destroyed, but beat up. At first, SpongeBob would seem disappointed that he got the card in such a state, but because the card will now remind him of his friend doing something nice to him, the sentimental value would outweigh its mint condition value. And then, to reward SpongeBob for his good attitude, they still could have done the twist with Patrick being like, "Do you want these ones too?" And he hands him the 4 other perfect condition cards. And SpongeBob is like, "Nah, this one is more special to me." And then Patrick could be like, "Great, because I could use one of them to open up my house because I lost my keys," and SpongeBob could be like, "Pat, no!" And that would be the end. This would be a much less mean-spirited and much more relatable story. I should know, because that's basically the story behind this card right here, my base set Charizard that I got for Christmas when I was a kid back around 2011. And I decided to play this card in a deck with no card sleeves. It's got a couple dents from that would definitely knock it down a few points if I ever sent it off to get graded. But there's something special about the fact that this particular card was played with. It has a memory attached to it. And it's too bad that this episode didn't really capture that feeling. I think the reason this happened is because in this era of the show, they really just didn't want to have sentimental messages like the one that is present in my rewrite. And it's probably because many other shows would have sentimental messages and they wanted to go a little against the grain. But when you go out of your way to be mean-spirited, to have your characters do ignorant and cruel things just for the sake of keeping us on our toes, you really lose out on telling a meaningful story. Chapter 5. One Coarse Meal. One Coarse Meal is an episode that is infamous for a similar reason to Are You Happy Now? But while Are You Happy Now's poor taste jokes are quick and wouldn't be understood by someone who isn't already familiar with what's being portrayed, One Coarse Meal outright explains that Plankton is trying to get himself run over. I know this is the part of the episode that everyone complains about, and before I rewatched it, I was thinking I was gonna be like, it's not that bad, guys. But no, it's pretty bad. Plankton says multiple times what he intends to have happen to him, and SpongeBob even repeats it in the next scene. It's not like a one and done little gag like Are You Happy Now? Well, it was kind of two and done, but still, both moments were over quickly. Whereas what Plankton is trying to do is harped on over multiple scenes. But why did this scene occur? Well, the premise of this episode is that Plankton is afraid of Pearl because she is a whale and he's Plankton. So Mr. Krabs dresses up like Pearl to torment him. Before I get into the mean-spiritedness, I want to talk about the thing that irks me possibly even more about this episode. And it's the fact that the kind of whale that Pearl is doesn't even eat plankton. This episode aired not too long after my school took me on a field trip to the aquarium, and we watched a documentary on whales. So I was like super into whales around the time I first watched this episode. And one basic whale fact is that some whales have teeth and other whales have these little string-like things called baleen, and it's those sorts of whales that eat plankton. The kind of whale Pearl would eat like squid or large fish or something. And yes, I know SpongeBob isn't 100% accurate to actual marine life, but this moment in the episode clearly feels like it's trying to teach you about how whales eat plankton, but it's just giving you misinformation. To tie this little marine biology rant into the actual point of this video, I think the fact that this whole thing with Pearl makes no sense is an indicator as to why the episode is so mean-spirited. A common theme with these mean-spirited episodes is that they aren't so much malicious in the sense that the writers are trying to make us feel bad, but in the case of most of these mean-spirited episodes, it's really just that since the writers have so little to say in their narrative and are grasping at straws when it comes to filling 11 minutes with something happening, they end up being left with nothing more than mean-spirited noise. Pearl being portrayed as a plankton-eating whale when she isn't is a symptom of the same writing shortcomings. But into the actual mean-spiritedness of the episode, which is that Mr. Krabs goes so out of his way to torture Plankton by dressing up as Pearl. The episode tries to make these actions from Krabs make sense by starting the episode with a Plankton formula stealing attempt, showing us that Krabs has at least a little bit of a reason for doing this. But what Plankton does at the beginning of the episode is just what Plankton always does. What is it about this formula stealing attempt that has awakened this much more sinister side of Krabs? Just about every other time Krabs does something bad to Plankton, which is usually some variation of flinging him back to the chum bucket, it's usually immediately after Plankton tried to rob him, and Krabs' actions feel a bit more justified. The narrative could have leaned into having Krabs maybe feel a little bad about what he's doing to Plankton, but justifying it to himself because he believes that it's what he has to do in order to protect his precious formula. But man, they make Krabs so unapologetic to the point where it almost feels like the narrative might be trying to communicate that Plankton does in fact deserve this treatment. It all just comes off so clunky. Like, Plankton is such a cartoonish villain. Even at the beginning of this episode, he's using all these evil science gadgets and stuff. So when Krabs repays these cartoonish actions with psychological torture, that feels far too real. It feels like two magnets that are repelling one another, with the cartoonish side and the more real feeling side just not vibing with one another. The narrative also does not make a meaningful statement against Krabs. I suppose the whole thing in the end where Plankton gets back at Krabs with Krabs' biggest fear, mimes, is sort of a narrative punishment, but the last thing that we see happen is Plankton running away from a bunch of whales that turned out to just be a projector. Like, Plankton was the victim for so much of this episode. Why is he getting the final comeuppance? Sometimes the show will do this with Plankton and also Squidward as well. Since these two are usually the characters who are in the wrong wrong in most episodes, they are the characters who get punished the most often. But sometimes in episodes, these characters are not the ones who have negative perspectives that are meant to be challenged, yet they end up getting punished anyway because they're the characters who usually get punished in other episodes. SpongeBob's role is also a bit of a mess in this episode. There's a moment where he feels bad for Plankton and even is the one to tell him Krabs is afraid of mimes, but then in the final scene, he's controlling the whale projector that delivers Plankton's final scare. So whose side are you on, buddy? And SpongeBob is usually supposed to be the moral center of the show. Sure, he's not always in the right in every episode, but it seems like in this episode, he's supposed to be the one with the moral compass. But we don't even know where he actually stands in this conflict, so it's all a big mess. So yeah, One Course Meal is so much worse than just its one bad moment. Sure, that one mean-spirited scene is the heart of why the episode is such a disaster, but the narrative is truly, all the way through, mean-spirited. Chapter 6, Gone. And this brings me to Gone. Now, Gone, for the most part, doesn't feel very mean-spirited. How could it be? There's no other characters besides SpongeBob for most of its runtime, so no one is around to be mean. The premise of the episode is that SpongeBob wakes up one day and everyone in town is just gone. He's completely alone, and throughout the episode, we see all of the different ways that he copes with that, eventually going full castaway and talking to a boat as if it's a person. The mean-spiritedness of this episode comes about in the end, where everyone in town comes back and explains to SpongeBob that the reason he was alone for so long is because they were off celebrating No SpongeBob Day. Now look, I can suspend my disbelief and understand that the point of this joke is the absurdity of an entire town of people leaving for weeks just because they think one guy is annoying. In fact, maybe the joke could have worked. I mean, it's a really unexpected twist, but the problem with this ending is that it doesn't meaningfully challenge SpongeBob as a character, nor does it teach any sort of lesson. So all we're left with is mean-spiritedness. To compare it to something like Castaway, which the episode is clearly referencing, in that movie, the protagonist has to actually take action in order to escape from the deserted island he is stranded on. The loneliness that he goes through is a motivator for why he emotionally needs to take such risky and dangerous action in order to find his way back to civilization. But in Gone, while we have SpongeBob struggle with loneliness, he as a character doesn't take any sort of action that makes the rest of the town come back. They just sort of return when it's time to end the story and reveal the mystery of why they were gone. The mystery itself is also really clunky, and the narrative at times just straight up lies to you so you don't guess what actually happened. Like for example, in the beginning of the episode when SpongeBob walks through town, there are overturned boats, implying that some kind of disaster happened. But these overturned boats don't make any sense in regard to what the ending actually was. This is not an acceptable red herring for a story. It's just a way for the narrative to act like it's more interesting than it actually is. When you see these overturned boats, you're like, ooh, okay, what happened? And then in subsequent scenes, you are now conditioned to look for clues about what may have actually happened to everyone else. A good mystery is one where you can at least sort of guess what happened before it's revealed to you. Not being so obvious, you're like, I saw that coming, but working well enough with the foreshadowing that you go, oh, I get it. The No SpongeBob Day ending has no such substance. Sure, you didn't see it coming, but that's because it lied to you earlier with the overturned boats. And that is why this ending comes off as so mean-spirited. Sure, the plot point itself is just downright cruel, but it's because this cruelness means nothing more than just the writers ending the story because time was up and trying to subvert expectations they previously set, that all we are left with is this awkward and mean-spirited conclusion. I think that just because of its ending alone, Gone sets itself apart as the most mean-spirited SpongeBob episode. All of the other ones I talked about at least try to have some kind of semblance of a happy ending, a conclusion that could leave the viewer not feeling so bleak despite how awful the journey was to get there. But Gone is kind of the opposite. The episode is actually really entertaining and mysterious, and then its ending just hits you with what might be the most mean-spirited scene in all of cartoons. Hey, thank you so much for watching. If you're interested in another similar discussion about poor writing, check out my Squidward torture video. Or if you want to see some of my live stream segments, you can check out this video right here. If you like what I do and want to see more of it, please consider becoming a channel member or supporting my Patreon. See you next time.